Claire Williams from SOAS would like to ask the panel, how much should I fear for the future of the Baltic states, given that Trump's ambivalence towards NATO? Well, there you have a new battery of missiles moved up there 10 days ago. Should everyone be concerned, or is it just Putin playing games? Malcolm?
I think we should always be concerned, and I think what's happening in and around the Baltic states is there is a military build-up now on both sides. NATO's military build-up so far is relatively modest, but it is gaining momentum, and it's a real danger that we are, with the Russians, getting into a process of slow motion escalation, of which it will be very difficult to escape from. My instinct, my very strong instinct, is I cannot believe in the end Trump is going to call into question NATO security guarantees. It would be so unpopular right across the foreign policy elite in Washington. What he is doing is he wants Europeans to pay more for defence, but that's not unfamiliar. That was a central part of Obama's approach to Europeans over the last 8 years, and it's beginning to bear fruit since the Russian problem got a lot worse over the last couple of years. Where I think it will be very interesting is how far Trump reaches out to Putin and says, can't we make a deal? I mean, his instinct is there should be a deal to be made here. His instinct is, I think, that small states matter less because they're not very powerful. And his instinct will be to make a deal over the heads of Eastern Europe and over the heads of Ukrainians in particular. But I think it's actually worthwhile having another discussion with the Russians. It's always worth seeing whether there's opportunities for reset. The question is what the Russians are prepared to give as part of that arrangement. Because, as has been mentioned, it's not only about Russian interference in the election. The Russians pose an enormous cyber threat to European countries as well as the United States. And the idea you can have a reset without that being addressed, I think, is fanciful. The idea that the United States can decide the fate of Ukraine by itself is fanciful because the Ukrainians have a vote, and so on and so forth. And it just may be, with a Russia whose economy is no larger than that of Australia, whose defence budget is only a tenth of that of the United States, of NATO, and it is continuing to decline economically, it may be that there are elements of the Russian elite to say this is the time to cash in our chips and get the best deal we can. If so, Trump may provide an opportunity to do that, but I'm not particularly optimistic in that regard.
There's a good question from Andrew Camp from the German Institute for Human Rights, and she'd like to ask, what about Trump's business interests? How far might they influence foreign policy, and what is there actually, Susan, to constrain a president in? We've never had a businessman as a president, so I mean, what you know the inside of American government. How much control is there to prevent a president slipping a contract through while he's doing a deal on Crimea?
Well, actually, this is quite concerning. One of the things that past presidents have always done is, even if they weren't billionaires, whatever their money was and whatever corporations that they were involved in, they put their money in a blind trust run by outsiders with no direct interaction with the family. So some lost money, but the idea is we don't have control over it. Trump has recently come out and said, first on the campaign trail, he said, oh, I don't know if you call it a blind trust, but it'll be a blind trust run by my children and my wife, which, of course, anybody knows is not a blind trust. Since then, since the election, he has said, well, in fact, there is nothing obliging him to put his money in a blind trust. There are constraints on other leaders of the U.S. And ethics rules and whatnot, but none specifically saying the president must do certain things. And so he's now come out with statements saying, actually, a president cannot be deemed to have a conflict of interest, which, of course, is not right. So, as you said, I mean, John, we've never seen this before. And it is possible that foreign businessmen coming into town will stay at Trump Towers. And because they will feel culturally that's what they would do elsewhere, so they should stay at Trump Towers. And so his businesses could be getting a huge bulk of money just by him being in office as the president. And if that stuff is not either hived off and, had a so-called Chinese wall built between it, he absolutely could profit off of everything in the office of the president. And it's very difficult to stop that. But that is why we have Congress, and that is one of the things that they can do.
Right. So, from the floor, who would like to ask a question? Yes, ma'am. If people could say their name and interest.
Thank you. Sheila Page, ODI. I want to ask about two areas which haven't been mentioned at all. First, Latin America, which I suspect for Trump is the developing world, and therefore possibly the area where he is most likely to get directly involved in one way or another, when there's a lot of scope for involvement, particularly this week. And the other area is international institutions in general, where he's made his views on U.S. independence fairly clear. What are the implications, not just for NATO, but for the WTO, after the Boeing decision yesterday, for the UN, and indeed for a couple of institutions based in Washington?
Ruben, is that a blank sheet of paper?
It's a blank sheet of paper, but maybe with some outlines drawn on, like in a coloring book. Let me suggest a couple of things. I mean, so first of all, Republicans, as a general proposition, have been are less sanguine about notions of international governance compared to Democrats. So that's already kind of an interesting sort of starting point. He has not made positive notes about NATO, as Malcolm said. That's been mainly with regard to equal payment. I'll come back to that point in a moment. He does not, other than building a wall with Mexico, he has not said anything with regard to Latin America and also NAFTA, I should say, and wanting to rebuild NAFTA. But again, he has already walked back so many things. We simply don't know what he's going to do in that regard specifically. But let me say two things in particular regard. I will say, happy to say this on the record, I am very concerned about his appointment to the UN. For his nominee for Governor Nikki Haley of South Carolina, who appears to be, by all accounts, from what I can tell, to be a very decent human being, who was, I think, critical of the president-elect on terms of his harsh rhetoric during the campaign, but has accepted this position. As Ambassador Page would tell you, there are political ambassadorships, and then there are political ambassadorships. That job is not for novices. And I am, frankly, I hope she has a very strong team around her, but it's not clear to me how effective she will be with regard to the political dynamics around there, particularly around the P5, particularly with regard to Russia and China. Let me, while I have the floor, say one thing to come back to with what Malcolm said and the question from online. I am actually gravely concerned about Russia and the Baltics. And let me tell you why. From the Kremlin's perspective, in the last 5 years, President Putin has been able to have his way in Crimea, in the Ukraine, and in Syria without any serious pushback from the United States. He has also been able to interfere in a U.S. presidential election. I think you could argue that NATO, politically speaking, has not been as weak since the end of Cold War as it is right now, with regard to turmoil in Turkey, with regard to questions of what the challenges to European Union means for the nature of the commitment to the transatlantic security alliance in obviously the opposite section of NATO, and also with regard to the president-elect's own, frankly, at best, ambiguous comments with regard to U.S. commitments to NATO. So if I were Latvian or an Estonian or Lithuanian, I would be gravely concerned. And I think that, again, this is an area where the United States will need its friends to help remind America what the nature of our commitments are and why they are so important in the years going forward.
Could I offer something controversial, Ruben? And that is that any of us who've worked long enough to have been around when the Cold War ended, in retrospect, you now look back, and it's easy to blame Trump for the future, as it were, but you can look back and you sort of say, what did we in the West do to say to Russia, how is your southern flank to be protected? What are the new security issues now that you've lost the whole of the bottom of your security? How are we going to help you resolve your security issues? And we should then have looked at the Ukraine. We should then have looked at Crimea and the rest of it. And Trump, let's feel some sympathy for him, he's going to be dumped with this utterly unresolved issue of Russia's security, which is all about Syria too. Why do they need a warm water port? Because they too have a massive radical Muslim threat in their own states, which is fueled by people coming in from the east. So, I mean, it isn't going to be all Trump. Most of it is a trap, not a deliberate trap, but a trap laid by us. What do you think, Susan?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
I thought I'd throw a curveball in.
Well, I'm going to answer a slightly different question.
Oh, why
not? So, a curveball back. I actually wanted to comment a little bit on what Ruben just said about the choice of Nikki Haley at the UN. One thing that has been said frequently in the media is that this is a cabinet-level position. But it has not always been a cabinet-level position, and we don't know whether or not Trump would make it a cabinet-level position, which could alter how she operates within the UN and within the rest of the cabinet. I actually think that that could make a big difference because oftentimes, you want your strong cabinet members around you to advise and guide you, but I wonder often if it is not a mistake to have the UN ambassador part of the cabinet and whether that weakens that person's ability to be neutral and separated from the cabinet where you've got the president also controlling the UN relations.
What about Ruben's point that she has no experience of diplomacy?
Well, I mean, I think what we've seen from most of the cabinet positions so far that have been pointed out, I mean, they don't have particular experience. I mean, his choice for education secretary is a businesswoman who has advocated for voucher systems for the public tax-paying American to pay for people to go to private schools. That's going to gut our public education, which is already failing. That's not going to help it. So I think we do have to look at a number of the choices that have been picked and look at their backgrounds and credentials. Why she accepted when she was somewhat critical of Trump, I don't know. He does need good people around him as well. And I would say, although not on an international scale, I think she did handle the crisis in South Carolina quite well about the Confederate flag. And she was really strong on that we have to get rid of these symbols of racism. This is 2000 and at the time 15, this is no longer the place for that. And she was strong when Dylan Roof allegedly shot the American worshipers in a black church in South Carolina. So she's done some things, but yeah, it's not international experience on a wide scale. So it is worrying, but all of them, to me, are pretty worrying as well.
I'm keen to involve Maha again because she raised really interesting issues about Iran and that whole segment of Trump's, well, his first day is going to have Iran somewhere on the list. Anybody have a question that relates to the Middle East or to Maha's? Yes, yeah.
Hello, my name's Colin Walker. My name's Colin Walker. I'm Head of Policy and Advocacy at War Childs. It's quite a simple question, and one that's going to be prone to quite a lot of conjecture, because as you point out, there's a lot we don't know. But quite simply, what do you think the election of Trump, taking into account his relationship with Putin, means for the likely outcome for the conflict in Syria and the longevity of that conflict?
Could you hear that, Maha?
I heard the first part, which is when would the
basically, it's simply what's the implications for the security of the future resolution of Syria and security in that region. Do you want to pick up on that?
Quite honestly, at this point, I think it's pretty dismal. I mean, already now things are changing quite quickly on the ground. By the time Trump takes up the position, his hands, even if he wanted to intervene, would already be tied. We're seeing what's happening in Aleppo. Part of the eastern part of Aleppo has already fallen to the Syrian regime. My concern is with this push and the support to Russia and the Bashar al-Assad, under the rhetoric that Bashar al-Assad is a partner against ISIS, we're just going to see a prolongation of the conflict for a long time. Bashar al-Assad is barrel bombing his own population. So, and, he pushed back against this. I mean, the scenario I see, frankly, is that, yes, they will get Aleppo. The opposition might be pushed into the area of Idlib. ISIS may be rolled back in areas. I don't know that Assad and the Syrian government has the manpower to take over and control all of Syria today. I mean, to control a country the size of Syria, you need to have some form of legitimacy. People have to cooperate with you. You have to have the infrastructure, the funding. I mean, a lot of things need to be in place. And given the level of destruction on so many different levels, both physical, but also in terms of the acquiescence of people to the authority of the Syrian government, I find it very hard to see how even the support for the continuation of the current regime will be able to take over and control Syria again. So for me, the prospects, frankly, are quite dismal. And I think that we're laying the basis for further conflict and further radicalization down the road. There have been some discussions, and I know some of the Trump advisors have thrown these ideas out of doing a kind of a confederal system or a federal system, decentralization. I mean, it comes under different titles, but it would all be on the basis of ethnic or sectarian identity. Quite honestly, going down that road means a considerable ethnic cleansing and population transfers, even more than what we have seen already in Syria. And again, we're laying the grounds for further conflict down the road. We haven't even mentioned the role of Turkey and the way it's been pushing back against the possibility of the emergence of a Kurdish kind of entity in Syria in the same way that there is in Iraq.
Thank you very much, Maha. Questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi, my name's Layla Varley. I just had a question in terms of a longer-term view and what there's been increasing dialogue around the Trump presidency, around Brexit, around Le Pen, it being a rejection of globalization. So my question is, in terms of a longer-term view, looking at 5, 10 plus years, do you think we're going to see a shift in geopolitics and with the US, with Europe, kind of looking more inwards and less outwards? And what scope will that leave for kind of other world players to, I guess, have increased power or to do something different?
Fine, thank you. Can I take a couple of other questions as well? Because I want to try and democratise the activity. Yes, sir.
Adrian Hewitt, also from ODI. We're not getting answers on Sheila's 2 questions about trade policy and about the Washington institutions, the international financial institutions, multilateral institutions in Washington. So these are areas where ODI does a lot of work. Let me try and give you some answers and see if you can respond to that. Trade policy. Obviously, Trump has tweeted lots of outrageous things before he won. He then proceeded to appoint Wilbur Ross to be Secretary of State for Trade. He hasn't yet appointed a USTR yet, but that'll come soon. Wilbur Ross, I mean, people say Trump possibly isn't really a Republican, but Wilbur Ross really was a Democrat until 2012, and yet he'll still get through Congress. So, things are rather more positive than we thought initially on trade policy. And it's very important for the rest of us, and it's rather important for ODI, actually. Secondly, on the Washington institutions. One of them, the World Bank, is fixed in advance. Trump can't do anything about the president of the World Bank because a year before he was due to be reappointed, he was reappointed with the consent of all the members. Unanimity. The International Monetary Fund is a completely different matter. It wouldn't surprise me at all if in May, Christine Lagarde got a call from President Fillon and got on the first plane to be Prime Minister of France, and there will be a vacancy in the IMF. Do you think, and this is my question finally, apologies, do you think President Trump will allow the IMF to be continued to be run by Europeans when the Eurozone in the G7 will no longer have an EU majority with Britain exiting and joining the other side and so on? So there's lots of movement there.
Okay, well, let me take one more question.
Can I do it?
Ladies first. And then I'll come to you first afterwards. All right?
Sorry, I've just been holding this microphone. My name is Karen Whitus, and my question sort of leads on to the first one, which is to do with the role of American leadership in the world. In all of these areas, where you see, or we're worried about a withdrawing. So, for example, in world trade, right? I mean, if the U.S. withdraws from a leadership position in world trade, what nation steps up? Is it China, whose economy absolutely depends on world trade? If we're talking about rule of law and democracy, which is my field, where I come out of, that was always, the flagship of soft power for the United States. If we withdraw from that, is there anyone who's going to step up and push that agenda to take care of some of these people that the ambassador referred to, who are activists in their own countries? If you look at some other great world issues where the U.S. has all climate change, right? If we really withdraw from climate change, is there another country that will step up and push this leadership? And is this really the eclipse of American influence in these really global, important issues?
Okay, well, let's try and address those, and then I'll come to your question afterwards. Who would like to kick off? Yes, Alex.
Well, let me start, I think, on the first question, because I think that this issue of the countervailing forces between long-term looking inward and globalization, first of all, are not going to be reconciled because they will continue to exist simultaneously. I think it's really important to acknowledge in this conversation, which I think is true both for Brexit and for Trump's election, that the effects of globalization have not been kind to everyone. And I think that the financial crisis and the rise in realization, and certainly in the United States, of fundamental and worsening inequalities in some cases are issues that need to be addressed domestically. If we do not do something about that, it will continue to polarize our country and leave people out and deepen poverty instead of improving it, even in the United States, let alone in the rest of the world. And these are deeply fundamental issues that do need to be addressed. And I think that was in part what was going on, at least with our electorate. At the same time, however, it would be ludicrous to think that the solutions to that problem are inward solutions. When you look at globalization, like it or not, we are affected by climate change. We are affected by the vicissitudes of trade and commodity prices. We are affected by what happens when in Russia and in the Middle East. And we are affected by outbreaks of disease like Ebola and others that will likely have worse impacts domestically as well as internationally. And so to see the trend of needing to deal with some of the issues at home, like failing infrastructure, which is a real issue in the United States, and inequality, does not mean that you can only deal with those challenges internally. Which brings me, I think, to one good thing and one bad thing that I would say. Just to carry forward the climate issue a little bit, the United States is critical to making the goal of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees in the Paris Accords real. And the good news story is that the United States has done tremendous things in the last 8 years to bring down our carbon emissions. That can be undone. And I think that it is critical that when we see the effects of increased storm intensity, of drought and flood, and all of the impacts that we're seeing from climate change, rising sea levels, those are things that affect us at home and as well as abroad. And I am concerned, but also hopeful that those domestic impacts will wake up the president-elect and others who he appoints to needing to deal with the problem. The one potential positive point, and this relates in some ways to the World Bank, although not the question of what happens at the IMF, is that something remarkable has happened in international development in the last couple of years, and that is that there is more money on the table than has ever been the case before. There is more public money, more private money, and the idea that we use more public money to leverage more private money to engage in helping to fill the infrastructure gap around the developing world that we know is going to either enable or disable development over the next several decades, requires people who understand how to get big deals done, people who understand debt and finance and leverage, and maybe, just maybe, Trump the builder will see an opportunity to do something interesting using the resources of the international finance institutions and the United States to actually see that infrastructure finance abroad is something that helps the United States and not hurt it, and therefore an America First policy can also be one that promotes development.
Malcolm.
I mean, those two were great questions in terms of where we go now. I think the first point to make is that both Brexit and the Trump victory were very narrow and deeply contested, and therefore I think we shouldn't automatically assume this is the future for the West. It's the most fundamental crisis the West as a concept has met, I think, since the end of World War II, actually. The institutions created, the norms created after World War II are under fundamental threat throughout Western societies. And Alex is absolutely right to point to some of the underlying factors there. This period of very rapid global growth is one in which majority of people in Western countries haven't had any increases in real income. You look at these figures recently in terms of the UK, stagnant wages year after year after year for the majority of the population. It's hardly surprising people are looking for what are called populist solutions. But they are populist in the sense they're telling people what they want to hear rather than coming up with a coherent solution. And I think we now I suspect the next years we're going to be in a period of really quite robust political struggle. The Brexiteers here have got a bit of a window of opportunity because they haven't defined what sort of Brexit they want yet. But once the government does that, and May doesn't want to define it because she knows that whatever she says, she's going to make a lot of enemies somewhere, but she'll have to pretty soon. And so will Trump. Trump will have to come good on these. And that I think, will create profound political struggle around that nationalist, internationalist axis that I talked about earlier. But the internationalists need to define what they want. It can't simply be back to business as usual. They have to tackle the issues of economic marginalisation, which affect a large part of their own populations. They do need to look inside a bit more and a bit less outside. I suspect it will involve a bit more protectionism, a bit less ideological support for free trade, no matter what impact it has on struggling communities in their own world. And the final point I would make is, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how China reacts to all this, because China, I think, clearly economically becoming more and more powerful, becoming more and more of a foreign policy and to some extent an international security actor. But China's policy is evolving. I think the way in which Chinese soft power is emerging is rather more important, that they're trying to sell themselves as the leaders on climate change rather than the United States, is really interesting and not entirely without some hope. But China also has its domestic politics, which is going to play into that.
So, Ruben, we have to come to you for the Washington institutions. The point was raised as to how many of these institutions were going to change under Trump, whether the EU would still be able to chair the IMF, etc. And the question that comes into my head too is, given the extraordinary range of issues we've discussed, is President Trump going to be vulnerable to the possibility that ideologues that he appoints will actually run the policy and he'll just tick the box?
Yes, absolutely. I think he is vulnerable with that. And I think part of the reason he is vulnerable with that is because he has not articulated, as I mentioned, a sense not only sort of a broad international worldview, but particularly as it relates to U.S. Place in the global economy, or what the role of the IFEs is in that space, other than to make America great again, which is, as Malcolm said, essentially the best way in which one can articulate it is some sense of sort of neo-protectionism. Although what I would say is two things. I mean, one is you are correct. The question is correct that the presidency of the World Bank has already been chosen. However, he will be able to make a choice of the U.S. executive director to the World Bank, which will be he could pick somebody who is, essentially either low profile or broadly consensus building, or he could pick somebody who's very adversarial, frankly. My money is more on the latter, but we just don't know. We'll see. And with regard to U.S. Either continued European leadership of the IMF or whether or not he makes a play for American leadership, I think it frankly depends on it's going to depend on a couple of things. I mean, one is what the timing of this will be in the context of the Trump administration, right? So if this happens within the next, say, year and a half, what is the nature of his sort of cut of the rug in the international sort of scene going to be? Is he going to make a major play? Is that worth the fight, frankly, relative to other fights he may have to play with regard to the Europeans or the French or other people? We simply don't know. Final thing I would say with regard to all this is back to Malcolm's point. It's not clear to me that neo-protectionism will lead to an increase in the domestic economic fortunes of either the U.S. populace or those of the Europeans. Because one thing we know is that free trade helps to create wealth. The problem is it doesn't help to distribute wealth more broadly. Right. So and that, I think, is frankly a fundamental matter of U.S. fiscal and monetary policy. I think is probably sort of true elsewhere. And this, frankly, is one of the great sort of conundrums of Republican policy. So there are things that could be done to help jumpstart economic development outside of the metropoli of the United States. One thing that President Trump has said, I think, could be of great use is developing greater infrastructure projects to help make the U.S. sort of more competitive. Ironically, I think only a Republican can actually do that. And President Obama did try to do it and was sort of castigated as a big spending liberal. But if a Republican wants to do it, then it's another rubric of making America great again. But whatever. I mean, I think as long as we sort of move forward, I think that's a good thing. But I do worry that in this sort of neo-protectionist environment, that we'll be making the wrong choices. And what we ought to be focusing is not only on continuing to strengthen the international trading regime, but also trying to figure out a way through domestic fiscal and monetary policy to make those gains be a bit more broadly spread at home.
Ruben, thank you very much. Susan, you wanted to raise something on globalization.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer a little bit on some of the globalization, anti-rejection of globalization that Malcolm mentioned, as well as the questions from the audience. And I think one thing, it's not only true in Africa, but it's also true in other parts of the world where the youth were completely against some of these changes. So the young people, even if they didn't vote in the Brexit vote, they are not in favor of, pulling back from world involvement. If you look at the continent of Africa, it is the world's fastest growing population. In most of the continent, 3/4 of the population is under the age of 25 and rapidly growing. So they need to be connected. They want to be connected. And they're not going to believe, whether it's in the U.S., young people who are entrepreneurs or others trying to do business, that simply pulling back is the way to go about that. It's our parents or grandparents maybe who are finally kind of catching on, learning how to, get on the internet and do things. But I mean, ask an 8-year-old and they're putting everything together. Mama, this is how you do Twitter. This is how you do whatever. They're connected and they want to stay connected. So I think eventually, even in the United States, people are going to recognize that Trump cannot bring these jobs back to America that have largely been lost, some, of course, through trade, but not that many through trade. A lot of them were lost because of automation, because of new technologies. That's a reality that they will wake up to one day and realize, I'm not gonna, that coal plant is not going to reopen. It's just not. And so the last thing I would say is that I think, and this is sort of to Ruben's point, is that we're going to have to rely on all of you, and you as Brits, those of you in the room who are worried about Brexit. We're going to have to also keep each other on target to remind ourselves of what our commitments are and why these things are important. I mean, I personally think that through our institutions, that's where we have the greatest chance of succeeding, and where Trump would have a much harder time rolling things back are the things that have been put into law through our Congress. And so I can speak mostly on the Africa side, but Alex mentioned some of them. We've got AGOA, the AGOA extension, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. We have now, he may want to play around with trade, but that's a legislative enactment harder to get away with. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, it looks at countries across the spectrum of how they are doing as developing their country on governance issues, on economic development, et cetera. I would really hate to see YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, go away. That has been enormously successful and is harnessing the energy of all those young people in Africa that really want to move on and develop. Somebody mentioned, I think Ruben mentioned PEPFAR, started under President Bush. This has helped enormous amounts of people get antiretrovirals for AIDS and HIV. Power Africa Act, it's now legislation. The Food Security Act, legislation. So these would be harder for him to roll back, even as he perhaps tries to think about cutting, U.S. aid and foreign aid.
Look, we've overrun by about 7 minutes, but the fact is the tube overran by 15. So we're going to take another 5 minutes, and then we will finish. So we'll take the last round of questions. You have the first one, sir.
Thank you. Jack Aldane for Development Finance magazine. It's good to finally hear about China in this, because it's an issue that I think perhaps the panel and generally everyone knows maybe least about in terms of what the ramifications are after a Trump presidency. But I wanted to bounce off the back of Malcolm's point and ask, really, how worried is the panel about 3 issues: trade, territorial disputes in the Asia-Pacific, and finally, if I could ask a direct question to Susan, if foreign assistance is being increasingly withdrawn from the African continent, how much does this open China's opportunity to intervene and get involved in Africa's affairs?
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else? Yes, and yes, yeah. So women first, so we go. You go, darling. Yep.
Hi, I'm Michelle Chivunga, founder of the Policy House. I'm just wondering, there's been a lot of talk, I think, during the elections around women's economic empowerment. With the Trump election, is there a threat to that? America has definitely been leading on a lot of the women's initiative, especially around sort of women-led businesses and access to finance. I just wonder, is there a threat to that? And then in terms of Africa as well, we've done quite a lot of work with young people and young girls as well. Is there a threat to some of the work that, that is going on around that as well? Thank you.
Great. And final question.
Alex, following on from what you said about how conservatives look at development as like a way to win friends, is there not a danger that US development policy can become a soft power tool and USA staff can become force multipliers abroad?
Great. Three excellent questions. Who wants to kick off? China?
On China, it's such a big question, of course. On territorial disputes, I think there must be a risk that China will misinterpret what the United States, what signals it's sending, and in relation to what, after all, territorial disputes about largely uninhabited coral atolls, areas sometimes not even above the sea. Hard to imagine this could be the trigger for a major power conflict, but I think it's possible that it could. And what China, I think, has been doing very cleverly is playing salami tactics. It's always been doing just enough to make sure it continues to advance, but not enough to provoke conflict. And it's a tactic which you see in a more robust and aggressive fashion from Russia. But China, I think, has been so far more subtle in the way it's doing it, but it's advancing. And at some stage, there must be a risk that it will miscalculate, and you'll get into a crisis in which the reputation of leaders is at stake, and which even the domestic political survival prospects of leaders are at stake. And as we've seen in the past, that radically narrows the options in a military crisis. So that would be what I worry about. The other aspect of that I think I would worry about, in some ways more, is that as long as it's simply territorial disputes at sea, then there are ways of managing. There are risks there, but there are ways of managing. But of course, and we see this with Russia, when it becomes political disputes or superpower rivalry played out within countries, rivalry about who's Philippines' best friend, for example, more of some of the weaker states in Southeast Asia, or you might see it in relation to Thailand or Burma or other countries in Central Asia, then it becomes less able for major powers to control. And you see that in Ukraine and Syria. Those are, on one level, they're proxy conflicts, but on another level, local actors have a say. And again, the history of proxy conflicts is that the major powers can't control what their proxies do, and that creates a potential for escalation. And some of the worst wars of the post-World War II period, the Korean War, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and their miscalculation there, were a result of people misunderstanding what the other superpowers were prepared to do. And that ending up in terrible conflict. So I think that's a real issue. China is a more cautious power. The big difference between China and Russia is that in the end, China still believes time is on its side. It wants to keep advancing, improving its strategic position, but time is on its side, it thinks. Russia is in the opposite position. Russia is a weakening power. It's got all the problems associated with weakness, and that's why I think we need to have different approaches to Russia and China that respect the fact that Russia is, in the end, a weakening power, a GDP equivalent to South Korea or Australia. China is already one of the second largest power in the world in many respects, and perhaps the largest in 20 years.
We're slightly up against the clock, so can we... Women's empowerment.
Yeah, so I think on women's empowerment, AGOA has had a tremendous effect on this, the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act. It's been extended for another 10 years a year ago. I do worry about what he might intend to do with AGOA and cutting that, because a lot of the hubs that have been set up have been specifically for women's development and women-owned businesses and promoting that. Sort of a correlation with that is the special representative for women's issues in the State Department. Unclear whether or not that would be a position that he would continue. They have done some tremendous things over successive years. Again, I think it would be really a disadvantage if that slowed down. The First Lady and the Second Lady of the U.S. have been very active in girls' education, traveling around the continent, in Africa in particular, but not only Africa, that girls need education, and not just STEM, but also STEM. So again, I hate to keep coming back to, we don't know exactly what he's going to do, but we don't. But I do think that those are somewhat at risk. And maybe just to answer your question on, again, with China, and if foreign assistance is cut, does that pave the way for China to get more involved? They're massively involved in Africa, and we have pretty much ceded our place, because China does what USAID did 50 years ago before it was really gutted by subsequent administrations. I mean, it's true. We don't do roads and buildings and infrastructure anymore. And as long as USAID is cut from doing those things, it means that contractors, because they don't have employee positions, they hire contractors, which ultimately costs us more money. But leaders are starting to also recognize that China is an expensive partner. So they're getting loans because it's sort of, the country is borrowing from its own central bank to give out these loans. So it's just this nice little circle. We don't have that luxury. Our system isn't set up that way. But they're also recognizing they're not necessarily getting a huge benefit because, A, they've got to pay them back, which they've usually borrowed quite heavily into the future. And secondly, China imports a large majority of its own workers because they have too many people that are unemployed in China. So they're not even getting the benefit of learning how to build the trains or run the trains. And Ruben knows this very well, that you go into the African Union building and the instructions are in Chinese because they built the building. And one area that we have been able to cooperate on, and this really did start under Ruben as ambassador to the African Union, was this U.S.-China cooperation in the aftermath of the Ebola outbreak in Africa, was Africa wanting really to ramp up its creation of the Africa CDC, the Center for Disease Control. And that has been one area we've been able to partner together on healthcare. And as Alex said earlier, one of the disappointing things that if Trump really does cut a lot of aid from USAID, most of the assistance, over a third of our assistance, not just from USAID, but elsewhere, is in the health and education areas. So it would have a profound effect on opening the way for others to get involved.
We've only literally got seconds.
30-second answer to the last two questions is that because we're at ODI, development works best when it is based on evidence and when it is targeted towards the things that aid can actually change. Aid cannot end wars, but it can do tremendous things like empower women to come out of poverty. And so hopefully what we will see is the best use of our development resources in the United States in their most effective way, which is ultimately what makes and keeps America great.
Your future director, pithy, short, and to the point. Ruben, a quick last word from you. Anything you wanted to say just before we come to a close?
Just say thank you very much for being part of the panel. I look forward to continued transatlantic cooperation in the years ahead.
Great stuff, thanks. And Maha, I'd love to hear even more from you because I'm really passionate about the Iran situation, but anything more from you?
Just one last comment. I think that if there is no toning down of the radical Islam, the kind of clash of civilization rhetoric, then this is the rhetoric that really appeals to jihadi groups. We unfortunately will see a much more increase in violence across the world. So I would perhaps this is an opportunity to try and find a workable solution around this. I'll end here, and thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this.
Thank you, Maha, very much indeed. And I was supposed to sum up, but I think I can sum up by saying what we have done actually is to very, I think, accurately describe the tapestry of challenges that really exist for Donald Trump, whoever he is. That actually, if you really look at the sort of scale of probability, if we take a 1 to 10 judgment as to where we're going to be in 4 years' time, with 10 being disastrous and 1 being sort of brilliant, I think we have no idea. And but I would venture 4 to 5. Can it be as bad as we think it can be? Can be as good as he thinks it'll be? The jury is out. But I'm very grateful to the ODI indeed for staging this, because I do think we've covered some fantastically fertile ground, and we're left with all the things that we need to think about as we go into these very uncertain times. So Ruben and Maha over there, Alex, Malcolm, Susan, thank you very much indeed for participating, and thank you above all to the staff of ODI for setting this up. Thanks a lot.